What's up, guys? Thanks as always for supporting the show. It would mean a lot to me if you would take a second to scroll down and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more of our videos. Also, make sure you follow us all over social media so you don't miss any of our content or show announcements. Moving on to the Knicks and the Sixers. And before we get too much further into this game, I want to kind of dive into that big picture topic I was talking about it as it pertains to offensive variety. So what I think is really fascinating is these two teams have changed the way they've played in a lot of ways. The Knicks through changes in their roster and the Cavs through a change in the head coaching job, right? So with the Cavs, all of a sudden we're seeing a lot more usage out of Darius Garland. We're seeing a lot more usage out of Evan Mobley. Evan Mobley doing a lot of work at the beginning of possessions to get the defense in rotation. And one of the things we're seeing is Donovan Mitchell's scoring volume is down substantially from where it was last year, right? Now, the Knicks did it through a roster change, but by bringing in Mikal Bridges, bringing in Karl-Anthony Towns, OG Anunoby at the tail end of last year, we've seen Jalen Brunson's scoring volume take a dip. Now, both players have maintained their efficiency, but their volume has taken a dip. Interestingly enough, we even saw Jalen Brunson say that he doesn't think he's playing particularly well. And I understand that because there's obviously another level that he can get to that he's capable of scoring more efficiently and at higher volume. But here's the thing. The Knicks and the Cavs are both top 5 offenses this year. Last year, they were not. And this comes down to a concept that I've been harping on nonstop since the NBA Finals last year between the Mavs and the Celtics, which is, yes, there's a certain machine that works when you lean into the individual greatness of one player, right? They get into great rhythm. They have unwavering confidence. You can spam actions and attack matchups, and you can get success out of that. But what happens is when you get into the playoffs, you have to win 4 playoff series against typically 4 very different types of defenses, and your advantages change from series to series. Same goes during the regular season. You're playing 82 games. Your advantages change from game to game, right? And in those situations, variety allows you to have a higher floor in all of those situations in addition to a higher ceiling, right? Because guess what? Like on one given night, it might be that, Donovan Mitchell has a really tough guard on him, but Darius Garland has a lesser guard on him, right? It might be a game where Jalen Brunson has a really tough guard on him, but Mikal Bridges has a really favorable matchup. Teams run out of bodies. Tonight was a perfect example in the Sixers game. There were large portions of the game where we had OG Anunoby being guarded by Guerschon Yabusele. And that's a huge foot speed disadvantage. And we had 3 really big mistakes in the run that the Knicks went on when they went from being up 2 to up 14, where it was Yabusele misses a mid-range jump shot around the elbow, and it's just kick ahead pass, and OG Anunoby's getting a dunk. And then here's Yabusele closing out on OG at the top of the key, and he just toasts him off the dribble. Now they're in rotation. They give up a wide open corner 3. Or the baseline dunk that OG Anunoby had. All that was literally Guerschon Yabusele sitting in help, swing pass. OG just ripped to the baseline, toasted him off the dribble, and got a dunk. When you lean into the depth of talent on your roster, when you keep everybody involved, when you play equal opportunity, when you have that variety, you can do a better job of capitalizing on the weak points in the opponent's defense. It doesn't make sense to repeatedly go at Andrew Wiggins every single time down the floor. Ideally, you want to try to generate advantage situations for your best player. And the best way to do that is get the ball moving side to side to run multiple actions. Not to mention, the more actions and interchanges you run on any given possession, the more potential there is for a defense to make a mistake. Sometimes you'll get just a wide open layup or wide open dunk or a wide open shot just simply because the first guy did his job, the second guy did his job, the third guy did his job, and then the fourth guy was caught not paying attention. Or they botch a switch. Or a guy overhelps, right? I mean, the Klay Thompson 3 that they gave up in crunch time on the skip pass, Moses Moody was too far in the lane. It was a defensive mistake, right? The more action you run, the more interchange, the more side to side, the more opportunity for mistakes, the more variety, the more equal opportunity, the more opportunity for you to capitalize on different mismatches. I don't think it's a coincidence that Donovan Mitchell and Jalen Brunson's scoring volume are both down, but the Knicks and the Cavs are both scoring at a much more effective rate overall as a team this season. I think that's a really fascinating concept. On the Knicks front for this particular game, it was kind of cool to see them start winning on the margins again. Like, they've been such an elite offense to start this year. Karl-Anthony Towns has been so good. We're going to talk about him in a little bit more detail here in a second. But like, part of what made the Knicks great last year was they won on the margins. They could go on defensive runs. They had a great defensive game tonight. They haven't had many of those this season. There's been a handful. They did it to the Pacers earlier this year. Like, they have moments, but they haven't been as consistently good defensively as they need to be. Tonight was a really strong defensive performance for them. They dominating the offensive glass has always been a substantial part of their identity. And like, I think tonight the Sixers and Knicks were relatively even on the offensive glass, but in the first half, the Knicks did a bunch of damage on the offensive glass. I think they had 7 offensive rebounds just in the first half. The pushing in transition, and part of this is like a weakness of Philly, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the Knicks scored 28 points in transition in this game compared to only 11 for Philly. And so, again, like, this is where there's the half-court battle, which is going to come down a lot to the roster. It's going to come down a lot to execution and those kinds of details. But on the margins, you increase your chances of winning by building margin in the small areas on the ancillary parts of the game, winning the possession battle, winning the battle in transition. Again, like, leveraging those things like we talked about earlier that are not dependent on shot result, that are things that you can consistently rely on a night in, night out basis. Karl-Anthony Towns front, it's fascinating because there's like some real basic stuff that he does that makes things a lot easier, like with his shooting ability. Like, he's trailing the play in transition, and centers just have a instinctual behavior, which is when they run back in transition defense, they don't think about the 3-point line. They think about the paint, right? And Cat, burned Embiid tonight on a transition 3 where he just ran up the floor, and Embiid's first few steps took him into the inside the arc, and Cat just kind of was trailing the play and he knocked it down. There's popping in ball screens, which has been a huge part of the Knicks offense to start this year. There was a really interesting strategy we saw from Nick Nurse tonight where he actually just had Joel Embiid stay home on Cat on ball screens, and then they offered help. You know how like usually they run a drop coverage, right, where the ball handler comes off the screen and it's the big man that's waiting to kind of corral things. They were just having Embiid stay put sometimes and offering help off the ball, which then of course got them into rotation. And then the Knicks were able to drive and kick on them. But that's the problem that Karl-Anthony Towns presents. That's the offensive ceiling that can come from having spacing from the 5 position. And so there's a lot of great that Cat does, right, with the shooting and the driving closeouts and all that stuff that we just talked about. But the other thing I wanted to touch base on was this action that we've been seeing all the way around the league. And I think it's actually a really smart example of just like how teams kind of copy each other and you see kind of like different concepts grow a bigger foothold around the league. But this thing that we're seeing where these teams are putting their centers at the top of the key with the ball and then having guards cutting off of them, there's a lot of opportunity to get open shots like that. And the Knicks are doing it too, where they're just putting Cat at the top of the key. And it's like, let's just have Deuce McBride run over and set a screen for Brunson and then have Brunson just sprint off of Cat's shoulder. And then as Brunson sprints, just have Cat kind of pivot into the defender's space and just float a pass over the top and he can get a catch. And now he's got dribble penetration. The defense is in rotation. It kind of goes to the stuff we were talking about earlier. Like, teams just make mistakes. Like, it's a simple set of reads that comes out of that, right? If Cat's at the top of the key and Brunson is chasing or cutting off of him, if the guard goes under the pick, then Cat just pitches the ball to Brunson and he shoots a wide open 3. If the guard chases over the pick and Cat throws the pass over the top, now you basically have no choice but to either help out of one of the corners, which is going to leave a wide open kick out pass to the corner, or you're leaving that one-on-one with Brunson with the defender trailing him, and he's just so good at either finishing or doing, what he did to Embiid. I thought it was hilarious on the play when Embiid got the crowd going, and then Brunson just toasted him off the dribble and then got him with the grift. Those two are it was kind of funny to watch their little back and forth because they're two of the biggest grifters in the league. And I've said this on the show before, I don't have a problem with the players grifting. To me, that's a problem with the league. You got to take that up with the league. They're just competitors that are trying to take advantage of every single advantage they can get to try to win games. Moving on to the Sixers for a second. The Joel Embiid looked exactly how I expected him to look. Like, he looked sloppy. He looked out of rhythm. looked like the game was moving really fast for him. I thought Stan Van Gundy did a really nice job on the broadcast of breaking down how, like, no matter how much you play behind the scenes, no matter how much you run on the track or run on the treadmill or do conditioning work behind the scenes, there's nothing that can actually replicate a basketball game, and there's nothing that can actually replicate urgency. Like, I kind of felt it a little bit tonight in the NBA Cup, and I felt it a lot in opening week when teams are playing their first like 1-2 games. Like, when there's real intensity and teams are kind of like viewing the game as more valuable than a typical regular season night, and you see that intensity come out, it's difficult. The game gets tough, right? It moves very, very fast. And so for Joel Embiid to step into a game when he hasn't been playing, and it's a particularly intense type of game in the in-season tournament. Again, a Knicks team that's off to a disappointing start that really wants to win that game, not just for the in-season tournament, but for their own regular season outlook, right? Like, it was intense. He looked a little out of shape. He looked a little out of rhythm. That, to me, was to be expected. I'm not paying too much attention to that. Paul George, for instance, is in the same boat, but he's just further along, right? First few games like that, the game where he hijacked the late possessions and took the step back three at the top of the key when Tyrese Maxey was going, like, he was not shooting the ball well in that stretch, right? In that first game, in his first few games. Tonight, you could see, like, starting to get his legs underneath him a little bit, starting to get more lift on his three-point shot, starting to look more comfortable from the perimeter, right? Like, it's a rhythm thing. You're building momentum over the course of the season. But like, I'm finding it hard to be too critical of the Sixers because of the way their roster is built. The roster is built around 3 stars. They don't have any other players on the roster that make more than $10 million a year, right? And like, what that tells you is in the market of these players and what they are worth, you have a lot of guys that are going to be flawed because they are tail end of the roster players that you're signing at heavily discounted deals because you have 3 max players, right? When you do it this way, when you do it through free agency, when you sign a player outright, like the way they did with Paul George, there's a certain amount of limitation that's going to come with that. I thought the big thing that stood out tonight is, like, when Tyrese Maxey is out, the on-ball guard play for the Sixers falls off of a cliff, right? It's Jared McCain, who we're going to talk about, who's shown a lot of exciting stuff over the last couple of games. But then after that, it's like there's Kyle Lowry, who's certainly on the tail end of his journey in the NBA. A lot of like Jeff Doughton on the ball tonight. And it's like, I'm watching this and I'm like, this is a big, intense NBA game where on one side, all the action is being run by Jalen Brunson and Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby and Karl-Anthony Towns and Deuce McBride and these like pretty high-level players. And then there's Jeff Doughton, who's running the offense for the Sixers for significant stretches of the game, right? But like, that's to be expected, because when your roster is built around 3 stars and any of the stars are out, you're going to struggle because the players have their flaws. Like, they have athletes, right? This is a team that has athletes. Like, Kelly Oubre is an athlete. Caleb Martin is an athlete, but they are discounted athletes because they can't shoot, right? They have their offensive limitations, right? There are other players on the team that can shoot the ball, but have different limitations, like Wershawn Yabusele, right? And Yabusele's actually been pretty good for the most part this season. The Sixers have actually been way better with him on the floor versus off, but he is an offensive-minded big who can really struggle in space defensively, right? So like on a night like tonight where he goes 1 for 7 from the field with 0 assists and 3 turnovers, then his limitations on the defensive end and in transition rise to the surface in a way that they don't when he's hitting shots. But that's the thing. Like, when you're shopping in that market, you're going to get a lot of one-way players, right? Guys that are really good at some things, but that have some substantial weaknesses in others. The big thing that stands out to me is, like, overall between Drummond, who's looking kind of big, Joel Embiid, who, as we talked about, who's just getting back into things and he's out of shape, the Wershawn Yabusele piece that we just talked about, some of the guards too, like, they're kind of slow, and that manifests in poor transition defense. Cleaning the Glass has a catch-all transition stat that they use. It's called defensive transition points added per 100 possessions, and it kind of just combines the transition frequency and the transition efficiency of your transition defense, right? Cleaning the Glass has them as the 5th worst transition defense in the league here in the early part of the season. What's crazy about that is they've almost always been a bad transition defense with Joel Embiid, and they were like that without Joel Embiid to start the year. And so that to me is probably the biggest weakness of this particular roster is you can run on them. There's a lot of teams in the league that are like that, and those teams when they play hard and they execute well, especially at home when they're feeding on the home crowd, they can keep things under control athletically, and then their superior gifts show. But when they lose control of that kind of athletic battle, that's when they can get run off the floor, and it can get ugly for them pretty quick. But in terms of like a silver lining, again, there's an advantage to this type of build, right? So when you build a roster around 3 stars and they're all healthy and they're on the floor together, then you have the ability to craft really small and achievable roles for your role players. Then suddenly these veteran minimum guys can come in and they can thrive. So the key is, and I know this is what we've been saying all season. I was actually pretty high on the Sixers coming in. I think I had them at 6 in my contender rankings coming into the season. And the reason why is like when they're healthy, it's like if they're in rhythm and it's like we got Joel Embiid, a perennial MVP candidate, Tyrese Maxey, who I had ranked as the 23rd, 24th best player. I think I had him 21st, actually. I have him in the top 25 players in the NBA. I'm a huge Tyrese Maxey fan. And then Paul George as your 3rd best player. You can't really do much better than that, right? And so there is a version of this that works. It just requires them all being healthy on the floor together, playing to their individual ceilings, so that you can craft these small and achievable roles. One last note on the Sixers. I want to talk about Jared McCain for a second. So he's had a couple of good games in a row now. And the big thing that stands out to me is he's got a strong, low center of gravity. And so when he's constantly running around, guys actually have a hard time bumping him off of his line, which allows him to get real dribble penetration. And he's constant motion, really attacking downhill in these ball screens, and he's kind of snaking along the baseline and making kick out reads. He's got a natural gift for identifying where relocation opportunities are. So he's always moving around and getting himself open shots. Like this to me is like half the battle of being a shooter. Battle number 1 is knock down the damn shot, but battle number 2 is getting yourself open against good defenses. And most of that comes down to perpetual motion. And like Jared McCain just brings perpetual motion to the guard spot with aggressive shooting. And again, just like a good, strong base. He competed on the defensive end tonight as well. I was impressed watching Jared McCain here in the early going this season. They're going to need a lot out of him over the stretch that Tyrese Maxey is out.